This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black Studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with writer and critic Michael Harriot. Along with numerous journalistic pieces in venues such as The Root, Yes Magazine, thegrio.com, he is author of the award-winning book, Black AF History, The Unwhitewashed Story of America, published by Day Street Books in 2023. In this conversation, we discuss the importance of study in journalistic and popular writing, the varied and deep roots of Black study, and the cultural and political responsibilities that come with writing about Black life in the 21st century. Good afternoon, Michael. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Here at University of Maryland, it's the first week of school, so I'm filled with both the excitement of the new academic year and a little bit of resentment at the end of my writerly time. but the weather has cooled off after a brutal summer, so all good. I'm super excited to have you as part of the series. I think your voice is really important. In particular, your voice, but also, my collaborators and I have been really working hard to get more artists, activists, and writers on the podcast. And so having your perspective, I think, is really important. The kind of work that you do, public-facing writing that is, journalistic, that's cultural studies, that's historically minded and researcherly, all that combination, to me, is so much about what the field of Black studies is about, and so what this podcast is about. So I was really happy when you responded just to have writers on the podcast, but in particular, I think the work you do is so central to the thing we call Black Studies. And that's just a long way of saying welcome to the Black Studies Podcast, and I really appreciate you making time.
Well, thank you for having me. I didn't know that I was doing all of that, but now that I do, I kind of get more nervous about it.
You write and produce pages, so counts as this. I want to ask, of course, about some of the things in your writerly practice and how you think of yourself, in the contemporary, but also historically. But I wanted to start with really, maybe it's a more personal question, and just ask you, what drew you as a writer to work on Black life? What were those experiences that were formative of that commitment? Whether they're childhood, education, communal, political sorts of things that brought writing and Black life together for you.
I think I am just realizing that the trajectory of my life from my childhood to, college, through my education, through my career, kind of created what I am now. And so I think it started with, I talk about in my book being homeschooled and not having my formative years inside of the American education system and being educated in kind of this DIY, find your own path thing that kind of gave me the idea that, critical thinking foundation. And it taught me that I didn't have to necessarily accept things or memorize things or when people told me things, think that it was true. And I think that was part of it. And I think, just being homeschooled when I started going to public school, I think it also gave me kind of a naivete on, like, I'd never been around white people before. So I kind of observed objectively, like, how people I'd known all my life kind of acted around when they got in white spaces. When I was writing my book, I interviewed my mother as if I was a journalist, interviewing any other person. And I'd never asked her why she chose to homeschool us. And she said that, it's a sentence I'll never forget. She said, "I did not think a Black child's humanity could be fully realized in the presence of whiteness." And so, but what it did is it gave me impetus to I had to learn about whiteness, not just as something I'd absorbed all my life, but I had to be intentional about it. I think that was part of it. And then part of it was just the trajectory of my career, from being raised in a family that was filled with storytellers, to my
Mhm.
mom being a writer, to like having a bunch of weird jobs, from local newspapers to working at an HBCU, um, covering everything. I mean, writing everything from the president's speeches to newsletters to alumni to addressing students to being the default sports information director. That gave me a basis. And then having a job where I kind of compiled these huge papers, these research projects, um, that for corporations, and all of those things gave me like this foundation of all of the skills that I use in my writing, from research to to studying to talking and addressing Black people. And then I think the one thing that really kind of formed this is when I was in graduate school. I had to uh I was accepted into this fellowship, and they told me it was a program at Florida State University, and they were basically have had this grad school program where you could build your own graduate degree.
Hmm.
And but to get in, you had to have at least one graduate course, and I didn't. So I moved to Florida, just to Gainesville, just for one summer, and took a course. It was a relatively new course, and it was at the law school. But I was just trying to get anything that would give me a graduate school course, and the professor agreed to, like, you can audit the course, but I'll give you a grade that could go on your
Hmm.
transcript. And it was a class called Critical Race Theory.
Oh,
And I think all of the combination of all of that kind of
in Florida,
right,
that's the time. I mean, in 2025, that's a wild statement, but yeah.
right, it got me to where I am now.
So, a couple of things. First of all, just hearing that from your mother must have just been like an astonishing thing. I mean, when you said you had never asked,
Right,
and then for the answer to be, I mean, that's metaphysical. It's
right.
like, it's like we're resetting like generationally and restarting something really important there. And then, um, I didn't know that about the creating your own graduate program at, you said Florida State, right?
At Florida State, and I initially started there as a film major, and then when I was accepted into this program, I was like, and I got this fellowship. I was said, well, I could go free, and I switched to a combination of international business and macroeconomics.
Hmm.
And so, studying that from that perspective, kind of a data-driven perspective, we had to create a course, like a sample course, an imaginary course. Like, what would a course that create a course that we don't have at this university that would benefit students based on what you're studying? And I created a course called Race as an Economic Construct. And they said, let's make this an actual course. And
Love that.
so I ended up teaching it there, and then at a few other universities. So I think all of that kind of combined to get me to where I am now.
And it's one of these things, not to turn this off the path too much, but it's one of these moments for me as someone in higher ed, of the real travesty of attacks on higher education in Florida. I mean, this is really important, innovative stuff. These are like world-class universities doing creative things. And so I hope that kind of stuff gets preserved because it's really
Yeah,
essential. Yeah.
I think that is the travesty. To me, the educational process has always been about discovering stuff that, not being able to recite or regurgitate information, but building a base and a foundation for the critical thinking process. And I think now some of that critical thinking is being removed. I think what we're seeing is that, they're putting boundaries on, like, you can think for yourself, but don't go here and don't
Mhm.
go there. And I think that kind of is a travesty in and of itself.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, you sort of alluded to this, and so I wanted to ask it directly. Um, what is the role of study in your writerly practice? I think sometimes people have a can have a fantasy that writers just sort of write from an imagination and inspiration, but of course there's study, right? That's at the heart of all of it. So I just wanted to ask you, what is the role of study in your creative work?
I think I think it plays a large part. I think one of the things it does is it gets me, because I think people imagine that everything a writer writes is something that he knows about, and not that something that he says, I want to find out and take a journey to learn about this thing and convey that. So I think the part that study plays is interrogating the thing that you're going to share with an audience, interrogating it intellectually, academically, and finding the holes, because you can believe something, right?
Mhm.
But knowing something is different, and having a factual and a data driven basis for it is different. And I think to talk about anything, you have to study it, right? And when it comes to history, right, a lot of times we assume or take for granted that, oh, this thing has always been this way.
Mm.
And I always start from the perspective of, well, why is this thing this way? And oftentimes that leads me down a rabbit hole um, that takes months and weeks and years to get to the bottom of.
Yeah, I love rabbit holes, of course, as a as a writer researcher, but I like that driven by the question of why rather than what.
Yeah.
What can we document, but also why is this the case, and that's a creative work of research that that good writing brings to the surface. And thinking about that writing, then what how would you characterize, or how do you think about your current work as a writer in terms of what you want or hope to be saying about Black life?
I think what I want to say is, I think everyone has, like, been in a room where, like, their grandmother or an old person, "Do you feel a draft in here?" Or they've heard something and asked the person next to them, "Do you hear that sound? Do you hear that high pitched squeal?" I think as Black people, so often we hear and see and feel a high pitched squeal of inequality or anti Blackness, and we'll think we're crazy because no one around us, the world, will say, "Oh, you're just imagining that, or you're just feeling something that doesn't exist." And what I want to do, and I imagine my role as, is letting people know, "Oh no, you're not crazy. That thing does exist. It is real, and here is where it comes from. And even if no one else feels it, it is real."
I mean, I think about so much of, I haven't for quite a while, but I am this semester teaching an introductory level class in Black Studies. But that's so often my experience as a teacher is the students, Black students, because it's usually 90% Black students in the classroom, just having exactly that moment reading, and it can be reading, Martin Delany, some 19th century
Yes.
thinker, and being like, oh, so we're not just sort of being paranoid in the corners of our house, right? And it's interesting how evergreen that task is for writers, that this was from the beginning. But as you said, that's a function of anti-Blackness, is not just creating conditions of oppression, but also creating conditions of needing to or of the sort of sowing of doubt, right,
Right,
at
that
every turn. Yeah.
right, and I think, what's interesting, and when you talk about Delaney and so many, of those of Black writers and thinkers, is that we see throughout history that, like, I can't come up with anything new to say that a Black writer before me hadn't already said. But so often are kept away from that information, and so in the absence of knowing that a guy said this in 1800, and a guy said this in 1850, and a guy said this in 1900, that, like, we think, that is what sows that doubt, right? If you don't, if you hadn't read any of that stuff, if you hadn't read Delaney, if you hadn't read, Walker's Appeal, you might think that, like, a Black person today is angry or crazy, or but if you know that, oh, there's been people who are highly regarded scholars who have been saying this and writing this and dissecting this kind of phenomenon for centuries, then you understand. Like, even if you don't, even if you don't expect the world to accept it, you know that I'm not crazy. Like,
Mhm.
this is a thing that Black people have been saying, for years. And I mean, when you think about this high idea of wokeness, right? This new concept that they created out of wokeness. And I always point out, like, well, yeah, point to me the thing that Black people are saying now, or the woke people are saying now, that they hadn't said 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Like, point out the specific thing, because there isn't one.
That's a great it's so funny, I never thought to phrase it that way. I love that, that absolutely stops everything in its tracks, it really does. And that sense of this having been said across time, I have these moments in my classroom where students really wanna puzzle it out, and I love this because I think these are really productive and important conversations. What it means, say, to be reading Richard Wright and feeling like this could have been written in 2025. And for them, I think their default is often that, it shows that things have not changed enough or, something like that. But there's such deep, like, metaphysical questions, like, is this the reality that we've created, right? That it's not really that I mean, I guess to say it's a metaphysical, like, truth, right? It's a thing that doesn't change, but it's also like, I come back to your mother's comment, right? It's like, how do you, like, operate against that, right? If this is a thing that seems like it's immovable or has barely been budged, what things are possible, right, in
Right.
relation to that?
Right. And we see that, not just with ideas, but with the reaction to these ideas. When you talk about Delaney, when you talk about Walker's Appeal, those things were outlawed, right? Like we're
Yeah.
seeing now what, I mean, there was what, a $10,000 bounty put on Walker's head, right?
Mhm.
And we saw under Andrew Jackson, right, where, abolitionists, uh what they call propaganda, or pamphlets, were outlawed by it was made outlawed by the federal government, and they could do it because they used the post office to do it, right? And we're seeing that now, and I think that when you have that historical context, right, one, you realize, like, you are able to contextualize what is happening now, and to understand that now is this thing that is going on now isn't a crazy thing that this uniquely intense white supremacist has created. It's a thing. It's a long trajectory, and it has a lineage that dates back to the 1700s, right? And the censorship of these ideas is something that has always existed, and we've kind of suppressed the historical knowledge of them to kind of reaffirm the mythology of America.
Yeah. And also, I think part of what happens also in that in addition to that preservation of the mythology of America, kind of white innocence and national innocence in that way. I think those synonyms in that project of suppression. But also, as I tell my students, it's like on the one hand, you can say, well, this is just like repeated testimony to this structure that doesn't change, but it's also should also raise that other question, which is, well, people have also lived alongside this. And so maybe there's some lessons about how to live in 2025. I mean, I think I taught a seminar on James Baldwin last spring, and that was the spring when everything was happening at the emergence of like an absolutely authoritarian fascist white supremacist regime. And I'm teach just outside DC. And so everybody's feeling it very intensely. But the thing that I was so happy about that the students took was that from the class was not just that, well, here's testimony to it. And so we know that this is real and it has a long history, but also that Baldwin was somebody also articulating what it means to live under this, right? That people don't just sort of stare in despair. They also have lives, and sort of what does it mean to create and resist at the same time?
Yeah, and I think that is an important thing for us to know and study and understand also, is that like the reaction to that, suppression and that oppression isn't just like, grabbing swords and shields and fighting, but it also exists alongside people living lives and thriving and building communities and building institutions and having joy and creating art. And I think that is also as important as, the resistance part.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a student asking on the last day I did a Ask Me Anything, and they didn't ask anything about me. They wanted, which is great, but they asked like, "What do we do?" Sort of out of this class, and one of the things I said, "Go to a gallery,
Yeah.
like see beauty, right, by the very people being targeted by this." And I don't know if they went. That's the thing.
Mm.
Students just go away. You never see them again. But so this next question I have, though, I mean, maybe you've already really answered it, but I'll ask it anyways. But how do you see your writerly practice in relation to the history of Black writing, history of Black thinking, creativity in the U.S.? Maybe you want to talk about diaspora as well. But also in relation to the future, like how do you situate your writing in terms of the history of Black writing? But also, do you think it's like pushing new boundaries, sort of opening new horizons?
Well, I think I see my writing as part of a lineage that includes, again, from people who from the 1800s to, now, including Delaney, including, I cite Du Bois. I write about, David Walker. I write about, the great writers who came before me. But I think one of the things that, we see in throughout history, as far as Black writers are concerned, is that it was always under the template of what white what the white mainstream deemed acceptable or scholarly or journalistically, and it was in that template.
Hmm.
And to me, what's interesting is about that is it controverts, and it is directly opposite to how Black people speak and talk and communicate with each other, right? Like this way, not just the literal grammar and language that we use, but the sentiment in the language. Like one of the things I do is people always ask me, like, how do you manage to be funny while writing about it? The trauma and the history of Black people. And I was like, well, I don't even try to be funny. I think what I do is I don't feel the need to remove the jokes. Like we'll make Black folks, we could be at a funeral, and if somebody walks in, you at your grandmother's funeral, your cousin might sit next to you and say, I can't believe she's wearing that hat. I had friend in my hometown passed away a few days ago, and my sister was talking to me, and she was like, me and your cousin JJ was next to each other. My cousin JJ is a preacher, a pastor, by the way. And she was like, and he was cracking me up the whole time. That's how we communicate with each other.
Mhm.
And for most of this country's history, in order to be accepted by the academy, by the field of journalism, we had to kind of remove that blackness and emulate this template.
Mhm.
And I think that we're seeing now that there are more black writers who are saying, oh, that foundation, part of that foundation is anti-blackness, and
Mhm.
we don't have to follow it. The idea of objectivity in journalism, for instance, right, is a white construct, right? Like, because what you're saying is like, because nothing can really be purely philosophically objective, right?
Mhm.
Everything comes from a perspective. And if you're writing about, police, and you take the police word as objective, you're writing from a white perspective, right? If you take, and I think that is where I think I am falling, partly because of what I said earlier about not being educated in that system, right? And viewing history through the eyes of critical thinking and blackness instead of a template that was created by the academy in part to create this mythology, in part to solidify white supremacy. So, for instance, right, we'll see, uh, you know, historians say they'll use stories that somebody else told about somebody else about, George Washington. But they'll say, well, there is no proof that this happened with black people because there isn't a written record. Like the oral histories don't count when it comes to black people. And the truth is that as a person who writes about history, as a public historian, there is no way that these oral histories can have survived for 200 years without a grain of truth in them. That they've been kind of fact checked by generations of people, essentially, and managed to survive, right? And but are less worthy than the George Washington had wooden teeth or he chopped down a cherry tree. So, you know, I think where I fit in is, as at some point I think I am trying to not necessarily uh it isn't necessarily my point or my objective, but I am intentionally disregarding some of the stuff that has been created to suppress our stories and suppress our history. Um, and I think communicating with Black people in the way that we communicate with each other is part of the context where I see myself.
I love that. Thank you. That was a really, really interesting way of characterizing that, and really important. And I just, yeah, I mean, this we're not recording the video with this, just the audio, but I mean, it's like this doubt cast on oral traditions, right? And not thinking about like what is the truth value of these, and taking it really seriously is and I don't use this word carelessly or easily, but it's an atrocity because these are ways of entire traditions being made and testimonies and witnesses. And so I love the embrace of that. I think it's always, been here and there on the margins of writing, but really moving it to the center. I appreciate that a lot, especially the way you framed it. And this may be also, you may have already addressed this in some ways, which is what do you think historically that Black writing has done well, but also what do you think it has not done particularly well?
I think the thing that it has done well is preserved our version of our histories. And I think, because I think that's important, right? So just imagine when we think about, like, for instance, this is a good example, right? When we talk about the founding fathers, right? We will take a letter that John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson saying, when we were here in Philadelphia, this thing happened, and here's how I feel about this thing that happened. And uh use it as history, right? So we'll say, well, Thomas Jefferson told John Adams that this thing happened, so it must have happened, right? And if we're talking about an oral, because what that essentially is a written version of oral history, right? And what we'll say as far as oral tradition in with black people, right? If my grandmother tells me a story and I repeat that story, it's essentially a letter from my grandmother to me, right? But she told me in person. It doesn't count as a historical fact, right? Because she didn't write it down in a letter, right?
Mm.
And I think when black historians say, well, we can't use this because it's not in a letter that has a postal stamp on it, then I think they're doing a disservice to our tradition,
Mhm.
right? The concept of a griot was a practice tradition of making history oral, right?
Mm.
You can read stories about, griots giving wedding gifts of a person in the wedding who's having the weddings, their entire family history, and they'd make it into a song. But they'd have to practice and research that song for weeks. And to say the song doesn't count, right? Because it's just a fucking song is wild to
Yeah.
me, right?
Yeah.
Um, And I think for so long, adhering to that template is kind of has been a disservice to what black writers do. But I have to admit that there are black writers who refuse to adhere to it. And I think writing outside of the academy, undermining that narrative is what black writers have always is a thing that black writers have always done well. And I kind of try to see myself in that tradition and try to use those people as examples of what I would do.
Yeah, so just, whenever possible, I like to just put in a little note intra podcast. There's a group, a not insignificant number of podcasts. I'm thinking Kelly Carter Jackson and Martha Jones in particular, who have talked on the podcast a lot about this, need to write history differently in terms of taking the personal, the family, right. I don't know that they put it in terms of the oral as you put it, but
Yeah.
really capturing exactly what you said. Like if you, as you, this is going to stick with me from this conversation when you said, my grandmother said this to me. That's like a letter,
Right.
except it isn't written down. And I love that as a starting point in characterization because it puts the question directly at the heart of conventional scholarship. I mean, if this was written down, we would be having a whole different discussion about its meaning.
Yeah.
What does it mean to have downplayed that? And as you said, it's not as if oral traditions are just like, are not just the product of deprivation of writing. It's also a tradition, right? The
Right.
griot, that's for me, such an important part. It's also a tradition. It's not deprivation. It's also the way people make and pass down meaning.
Right. And I think, like, I remember when I was in college and my grandmother, I called my grandmother and asked her for, like, how to make candied yams. And she gave me her recipe and she said, well, I put more nutmeg in than cinnamon, right? But your grandmother who taught me, she used more cinnamon than nutmeg. And so, it just depends on how you like the taste. Well, I like more cinnamon than nutmeg. So I ended up using, my grandmother's recipe. Well, my grandmother's grandmother was a slave,
Hmm.
right? So that is when we pass down those traditions and recipes, for lack of a better word, right, that make us who we are, we kind of think of them as centuries ago, but it wasn't really that long ago. My grandmother had 11 children. My grandmother on my father's side had 11 children. Um, they were always activists. My aunt and uncle, Ike and Rebecca, who were twins, when they were 15 years old, they were arrested at a protest. That protest became the Supreme Court case, Edwards versus South Carolina, which essentially determined that protesting was a form of free speech, right? They were the youngest plaintiffs arrested when they were 15 years old. Ike became like the longtime director of the South Carolina NAACP for 25 years, and then he left to help get the first black congressman from South Carolina since Reconstruction elected, Jim Clyburn. Um, but they were like the younger of the children, right? Their oldest sisters were, running around with Septima Clark. And when I started doing my family history, my grandmother was born on the plantation where every previous generation of her family in America had lived. She was born in 1915. Her grandfather was, in the 33rd Regiment, literally burning plantations with Harriet Tubman, right? Right. And they, so my grandmother's grandfather freed their family essentially in the U.S. colored troops. So you have to believe that they passed down, not even knowingly, that tradition of resistance, just like they passed down a candied yam recipe, right? And to disregard that or to include that, like you have to include that and understand that in the history of or the recording of an oral tradition or the recording of history, just as much as you have to remember that, this person was a descendant of Thomas Jefferson, or this person that lives on this plantation, had it built by their forefathers, because when you think about some of those, how we record history for some things and not the others, I think it is important to realize that, like, what we are passing down is an inheritance that is more than just physical. And the same way, like, we imagine that America is built on the ideals of some white dudes from 250 years ago, how I live is built on ideals that my grandmother inherited. And I think that is the thing that is important to understand when recording history and reading Black writers.
Beautiful. I love that. I'm so happy to also just to have their names on the podcast. So, and that's quite an inheritance for you to get. I mean, I like that as both, deeply pedagogical about the kinds of things that you draw on, but also as a sense of responsibility. I mean, that's to put it lightly, a high standard for, what it means to move forward and to write and act. I love that. Last question for you. Thinking about, artists and critics who are concerned with Black life, what is the one issue or the one question you would like us all to be asking?
I think the thing that, just boiling it down to one is pretty hard.
You can
I
have a
think,
few. I don't think anybody's ever had just one.
I think, one of the things that I am always contemplating is the reckoning or kind of trying to understand the conflict between survival and resistance, right? Because, you know, I see people, there are some people who say, well, if I don't upset the boat, then, maybe I get to survive, and maybe I get to maybe make a few more dollars, or feed my family, or, you know, climb higher up this ladder. And I think that is a thing that I am always reckoning with when I look at people who don't necessarily share, especially Black people who don't necessarily share the the ideas and the concepts that I shared. And the other thing that I think is important to think about, right, is what America is. This is an idea that I've always grappled with because I've never understood what America is and what loving America means,
Mm,
right? Because what does it mean? Does it mean that I love the people in this country more than I love people, other human beings? Does it mean that I love like the dirt and the soil inside the boundaries on this map more than I love other people? And then you have to, once you ask yourself that question, you have to grapple with what is America, right? Because when we talk about the American ideals, doesn't mean anything if we never did those ideals. We never did the stuff that we conceived of um, by the founders. We never treated all men as if they were created equal. We never tried to make a more perfect union. We're not trying to do it now. We're trying to go back, right? We've never, like, all of the foundational beliefs that we consider America, if we've never done those things, right? And if the soil and the boundaries and the map exists on things that we've taken from other people that were anti-democratic, right? If it was done through manifest destiny and removal, like, what is the thing that we're trying to preserve? Is it worth even preserving? And I think that is the thing to me that I've always tried to grapple with, because starting from the default of I am a human being that is a product of this country, and not asking yourself what this country is, right?
hmm.
What at its foundation? Is it an idea? Is it the boundaries on the map? Or are we so naive to think that we are the first person and the only people to have these democratic ideas? Or did we just sell them for? We got a better PR department than everybody else, because everybody kind of
Yeah.
wants democracy and freedom, and believes in a higher power and wants all people to be equal. But do we just have a better PR department and a big statue in New York Harbor? And I'm always grappling with that thing, because I'm always trying to and this is ultimately what I'm trying to do, is to undermine the thing that I believe, to see if it still holds water, right? If it is true, then it should be able to withstand the pressure of me examining it, interrogating it. And so, interrogating the foundation of who we are, what this country is, and who we are as Black people. What does Black mean, right? Um, is like is it one drop, right? If I've never been raised in a Black community around Black people, then what does Black mean, right? Like, who is Black? What is white? Interrogating all of those things, I think, is something that we should think about.
I love all of that. That's such a fantastic place to wrap up. I mean, those are the biggest and hardest questions, but I mean, as you pointed out in your comment, they're also at the heart of our everyday speech. You know, what does it mean to put the way we talk about the world under that level of scrutiny and see what withstands the pressure? I like that way of putting it too. What survives our pressure. as thinkers and critics. So, thank you so much. And I was really looking forward to this. This has been so interesting and is such a wonderful contribution to the series. So, thank you for your time, but thank you for your insight and thoughtfulness. This is really, really fantastic.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your day.
You too.
All right. Bye bye.